The rhythmic, hollow beep of the ICU monitor was the only thing keeping me breathing. My 8-year-old daughter, Harper, lay motionless, her delicate neck trapped inside a heavy, terrifying metal halo brace. She looked so incredibly small, so entirely broken. Then, the heavy wooden door pushed open. I did not turn around immediately. I was too busy staring at the pale skin of her little hand. My mind kept flashing back to yesterday, just 24 hours ago. She had been running through the sprinklers in our backyard, her laughter echoing over the wooden fence, begging me for another push on the swing. Now, she was a prisoner in her own body, surrounded by a tangled mess of clear plastic tubes and the terrifying, cold hum of life support machines. My name is Grant. For the last 10 years, I have lived a quiet, invisible, deeply ordinary life. I built a wooden deck in the backyard. I coached Little League baseball on weekends. And I carefully packed peanut butter sandwiches into colorful school lunchboxes every single morning. Nobody in this sleepy, scenic suburban town knew about my past. Nobody knew what I used to do in the dark, unforgiving corners of the globe. To my neighbors, to the local school teachers, and even to my own wife, I was just a soft-spoken architect who designed office buildings. Heavy footsteps echoed against the cold, sterile linoleum floor of the intensive care unit. The distinct, authoritative sound of thick leather boots and the heavy clinking of law enforcement utility belts broke the silence. I finally stood up, my knees aching from hours of sitting in the rigid plastic hospital chair. I brushed the wrinkles out of my faded flannel shirt, took a deep breath to steady my shaking hands, and turned around to face the men who had just walked into my daughter's room. Sheriff Victor stood at the foot of Harper's bed. He was a massive, imposing man, wearing his crisp khaki uniform and his local authority like a thick, impenetrable coat of armor. Standing slightly behind him in the shadows of the doorway were two of his closest deputies, Blake and Kyle. Their faces were blank, completely professional, and entirely unreadable to the average, trusting civilian. But I was not an average civilian. Grant, Sheriff Victor said, slowly taking off his wide-brimmed hat and holding it over his chest. His voice was deep, coated in that fake, overly practiced sympathy that politicians and liars use when they want to get out of an uncomfortable room as quickly as possible. I cannot tell you how truly sorry we are. The boys and I, we are just devastated by this horrific tragedy. The whole department is pulling for little Harper. I looked at him. I really looked at him, studying the tight lines around his eyes and the rigid posture of his shoulders.
What exactly happened out there, Victor?
The surgeon said her spine was fractured in 2 separate places. They said the impact was localized, brutal. That does not happen from just falling off a bicycle on a flat dirt path near the woods. Victor sighed heavily, running a thick hand over his jaw to feign exhaustion. It was a hit and run, Grant. Out near the old county quarry, we found heavy tire tracks in the mud. A large truck, probably passing through from out of state. We are doing absolutely everything we can, putting every available man on it. But you know how these remote county roads are? There are no traffic cameras out there. No witnesses. We might never actually find the guy who bumped her off the road and kept driving. Victor's eyes did not match the sorrow in his heavy words. They were cold, calculating. He was watching my reaction with laser focus, studying my face to see if I bought his tragic story. I knew exactly what I had to do. I nodded slowly, playing the part of the shattered, helpless, grieving civilian father. I let my shoulders slump forward in defeat. I forced my breathing to become shallow and ragged, and I let a single heavy tear fall down my cheek. Thank you, Victor. Thank you for looking into it and trying your best, I whispered, making sure my voice trembled perfectly with vulnerability. Victor nodded, seemingly satisfied that the stupid, trusting father had swallowed the lie whole. He turned to leave the room. And in that fraction of a second, as he pivoted toward the door and thought my eyes were on the floor, He looked over his shoulder at Deputy Blake. Victor smiled. It was barely there. A microscopic, subtle, incredibly cruel smirk that curled the corner of his upper lip. A look of absolute arrogant victory. A look that said, without a single spoken word, "We handled it. We got away with it." In my former life, recognizing a micro-expression exactly like that meant someone in the room was about to die. It meant extreme deception. It meant the enemy was standing right in front of me. I'm going to pause my story right here for just a second. If you have ever felt the cold, sharp sting of betrayal from someone you trusted deeply, hit like, subscribe for more betrayal stories, and comment your city or country. Let me tell you how my entire reality shattered. The hospital room suddenly felt entirely different. The sterile air grew incredibly thick, suffocating me. My crushing sorrow was instantly swallowed by a freezing, terrifying, crystal-clear realization. Harper had not been hit by a random, out-of-state truck. The men who did this to my little girl, the men who broke her neck and left her in the dirt, were standing right in front of me, wearing shining silver badges. But why? Why in the world would the powerful local sheriff target an innocent 8-year-old girl? My mind raced at 1,000 miles an hour, pulling apart the variables, analyzing the threat, looking for the missing piece of the puzzle. Then, the second, far more devastating blow landed. The hospital room door swung open violently, and my wife, Brooke, rushed inside. She was completely out of breath, her blonde hair a messy, chaotic tangle, her mascara slightly smudged under her eyes. In a moment like this, you would expect a loving mother to run straight to her critically injured child. You would expect her to collapse by the bedside, to weep uncontrollably, to gently hold her daughter's fragile hand and beg her to wake up. Brooke did not do any of those things. When she burst into the room, her eyes did not immediately dart to the beeping heart monitor. They did not look at the horrifying metal halo brace drilled into Harper's skull. Brooke's eyes went straight to Sheriff Victor. For 2 full, agonizing seconds, they held intense eye contact. It was a silent, desperate conversation happening right in front of my face. An exchange of hidden panic from her, and calm reassurance from him. Victor gave her a tiny, almost imperceptible nod of his head. Brooke let out a long, shaky breath, her tense shoulders instantly dropping in profound relief, before she finally turned her head toward me. She manufactured a loud, theatrical, echoing sob, throwing her arms around my neck and burying her face in my chest. "Oh, Grant, our poor baby!" "I came as fast as I could," she cried, her voice echoing loudly off the hospital walls. She smelled like expensive, heavily perfumed hotel soap, not the soft floral perfume she kept on her vanity mirror at home. Crisp, generic hotel soap, in the middle of a Tuesday afternoon. On the exact same day, our daughter was brutally attacked and left for dead. I wrapped my arms slowly around my wife, holding her tight against me. I stroked her hair gently, playing the role of the comforting, oblivious husband perfectly. But inside my chest, my heart was no longer breaking. It was pounding a slow, rhythmic, terrifying drum of war. I had spent the last decade working so hard to bury the dangerous man I used to be. I had locked away the elite operator, the silent interrogator, the invisible ghost who dismantled cartels and erased high-level threats in the dead of night. I promised Brooke on our wedding day that I would never ever be that dark, violent man again. But as I held my cheating, complicit wife and looked over her shoulder at the empty doorway where the crooked sheriff had just smiled at my daughter's broken body, I realized the peaceful architect was completely gone. They had murdered him today in this very room. They thought I was weak. They thought I was just a sad, pathetic, middle-aged dad they could easily manipulate, blindside, and destroy to get whatever dark thing they were after. They had absolutely no idea who they had just woken up. I did not yell. I did not scream. I did not throw a reckless punch and get myself arrested. I just kept holding Brooke, staring blankly at the sterile white hospital wall, making a silent, unbreakable promise to the universe. By dawn, they were all going to lose absolutely everything. The morning sun broke through the heavy gray clouds, casting a pale light over the quiet suburban streets. I had not slept for a single second. After sitting by Harper's bed all night, listening to the mechanical breathing of her ventilator, I finally stood up and walked out of the hospital. I needed to act. If the local police were going to sweep my daughter's broken spine under the rug as a simple hit and run, I was going to force the legal system to do its job. I drove straight to the county courthouse to file a formal demand for an independent investigation. The building was old, grand, and suffocating. I walked into the chambers of Judge Julian, a man with silver hair who was well known in our small town for playing golf with Sheriff Victor every Sunday. I stood in front of his massive mahogany desk, my hands resting on the polished wood. I laid out the medical reports. I pointed out the inconsistencies in the tire tracks. I begged him to look at the facts. "Mr. Grant, I understand you are grieving," Judge Julian said, slowly removing his reading glasses. He did not even bother to look at the paperwork. "This is a terrible, heartbreaking tragedy. But an accident on a remote dirt road without a single witness? There is simply no legal basis for me to approve a county-wide witch hunt. The sheriff's department has already closed the preliminary report. Go back to the hospital. Be a father to your daughter." I stared into his eyes. There was no sympathy there, only a cold, calculated dismissal. The entire system was a brick wall, carefully built to protect its own. I slowly gathered my papers, nodded respectfully to avoid raising any suspicion, and walked out into the cold morning air. I drove back to our quiet, empty house to pack some fresh clothes for Harper and myself. Brooke had told me she was going to the pharmacy to pick up her anxiety medication. She said she could not handle sitting in the ICU and just watching our little girl suffer without doing something. I had believed her. I wanted to believe that somewhere, buried under the lies, she was still a mother. But as I walked into our bedroom, my eyes caught something on the floor near her closet. It was a receipt from a local hardware store, time-stamped from the exact hour Harper was found on the dirt road. Brooke had not been at her office. The old, deeply buried instincts of a Delta Force operator woke up completely. I did not panic. My heart rate dropped to a slow, steady rhythm. I opened Brooke's laptop on the desk. She was careless, leaving her email open. There were no messages to Victor, but there was a calendar notification for a private, unlisted address on the edge of town, an old, abandoned motel that the county had shut down years ago. I left the house immediately. I did not take my family's SUV. I took my old motorcycle, keeping my helmet visor down so I would be completely unrecognizable. When I arrived at the abandoned motel, the gravel parking lot was empty, except for two vehicles hidden behind the decaying brick wall of the back alley. One was Brooke's silver sedan. The other was a dark, unmarked county cruiser. I killed the engine and pushed the motorcycle into the thick brush. Moving silently through the overgrown weeds, I approached the back window of the motel room. The glass was cracked, and the curtains were drawn tight, but a small gap remained. I pressed my back against the damp brick wall and listened. "Victor, I cannot keep acting like this." Brooke's voice leaked through the crack in the glass, trembling with panic. Grant was staring at me in the hospital room. He looked right through me. What if he knows? "He does not know anything, Brooke. Calm down." Sheriff Victor's deep, arrogant voice echoed back. "He is just a weak, pathetic architect. He is grieving. Men like him do not ask dangerous questions. They just cry and accept whatever the law tells them." But Harper, Victor, her neck. Brooke sobbed, though the sound lacked any real maternal warmth. It was the sound of a woman terrified of losing her own comfortable life. "You promised me she would just get a broken arm. You promised she would just be scared enough so we could claim the stress and finalize the custody papers." I stopped breathing. The cold air burned my lungs, but I could not exhale. "My deputies had to make it look real, Brooke," Victor snapped, his tone turning vicious. "If it was just a scratch, the courts would never grant us what we need. We are almost at the finish line. Do you want the life we planned, or do you want to stay in this boring, pathetic marriage forever? Just keep crying. Keep playing the victim. Tomorrow we sign the papers." A suffocating, agonizing weight crashed down onto my chest. The betrayal cut deeper than any bullet I had ever taken in combat. My own wife. The woman who had sworn to love and protect our family had conspired with this monster to physically destroy our 8-year-old daughter. She traded Harper's safety for a secret affair and whatever twisted financial plan they had built together. She did not care that her daughter was lying in a hospital bed, fighting for every single breath. I slowly backed away from the window. My hands were not shaking anymore. The devastating grief that had clouded my mind for the last 24 hours completely evaporated. It was replaced by a terrifying, absolute clarity. They had bought the local police. They had bought the judges. They thought they had perfectly manipulated a soft, grieving civilian father. They were wrong. I walked back to my motorcycle in total silence. I was no longer a husband. I was no longer an architect. As I put my helmet on and looked back at the decaying motel room, I knew exactly what I had to do. The time for asking the law for help was over. Tonight, the ghost was going to wake up. And by tomorrow, they were going to wish they had never heard my name. I parked my motorcycle in the garage and walked back into the hospital just as the sun began to set. My boots made no sound on the polished tiles. When I pushed open the heavy wooden door to the ICU, Brooke was sitting in the plastic chair beside Harper's bed. She was holding a damp tissue, her eyes red, playing the part of the shattered mother flawlessly. "Where were you?" she whispered, her voice trembling with manufactured grief. "I woke up from my nap and you were gone. I was so terrified, Grant. I looked at the woman I had loved for 12 years. I looked at the hands that had packed my lunches, the lips that had kissed me goodnight, and the eyes that had coldly agreed to break our daughter's spine. The urge to scream, to tear the room apart, was completely suffocating. But military training does not just teach you how to survive a war zone. It teaches you how to bury your heart under a mountain of solid ice." "I just needed some air," I replied softly, walking over and placing a gentle, reassuring hand on her shoulder. "I am right here, Brooke. I am not going anywhere." She leaned her head against my arm, completely unaware that she was resting against a ghost. When midnight finally arrived, Brooke went home to sleep. I told her I would take the night shift by the monitors. But as soon as her silver sedan pulled out of the hospital parking lot, I called the night nurse to sit with Harper. I had work to do. I drove to our house and went straight down to the basement. Behind a false wall of drywall and insulation, hidden beneath boxes of old Christmas decorations, was a heavy black transport case. I had not opened it in 10 years. The heavy latches snapped with a sharp, metallic click that echoed in the dark room. Inside, there were no heavy rifles or explosive charges. My revenge was not going to be a loud, reckless shootout that would land me in a federal prison while my daughter grew up alone. Inside the case was the hardware of a phantom. Encrypted hard drives, GPS trackers no bigger than a coin, parabolic microphones, and thermal optical lenses. I stripped off my soft flannel shirt and pulled on a dark, fitted tactical sweater. Looking in the mirror, the tired, grieving architect was completely gone. The man staring back had cold, dead eyes. At 2 a.m, I was positioned on the roof of a commercial bakery across the street from the county sheriff's dispatch center. The freezing night air bit at my face, but I did not feel it. Through my thermal optics, I watched Sheriff Victor's 2 favorite deputies, Blake and Kyle, walk out the back door. They were laughing, smoking cigars. Acting like kings of a town they had secretly turned into their own personal playground. They climbed into a marked cruiser. Before the engine even turned over, I was already moving. I had planted a micro-tracker under their rear bumper 30 minutes earlier. I tailed them from 3 miles away, tracking their GPS dot on my encrypted tablet. They drove out to the industrial park on the edge of the county, pulling into the loading dock of a private shipping warehouse. I parked my motorcycle in a drainage ditch and moved through the shadows of the shipping containers with absolute silence. Climbing the rusted fire escape of the adjacent building, I aimed my directional microphone at the open warehouse door. The audio fed directly into my earpiece, crystal clear. "Victor wants the cash moved by Friday," Deputy Kyle was saying, his voice echoing over the sound of heavy wooden crates being pried open. "He said the trust fund payout is guaranteed to clear the accounts by next week. The wife signed the preliminary medical papers this afternoon." "Brooke?" Deputy Blake chuckled, a disgusting, arrogant sound. "Man, she is cold. Trading her own kid's legs for a $2 million insurance payout and a one-way ticket to the coast with the boss." My grip on the microphone tightened so hard my knuckles turned completely white. $2 million. That was the price tag they had put on my little girl's life. A trust fund set up by my late father, meant for Harper's college and future, accessible only in the event of severe, life-altering medical tragedy. They had orchestrated a crippling accident just to unlock the vault. "Just make sure the truck we used for the hit and run stays buried at the scrapyard," Kyle warned, tossing a stack of bound cash into a duffel bag. "If the state troopers find it with Harper's paint on the bumper, we all go down. Victor cannot protect us from the state boys." I pressed the record button on my device. The red light blinked steadily in the dark. I had the motive. I had the confession. I had the exact location of the weapon they used to crush my daughter. But bringing this to the local police was useless. Victor owned the town. Handing this to the local judge would just get the evidence destroyed. I needed a storm they could not control. As I descended the fire escape and melted back into the shadows of the night, my encrypted phone vibrated in my pocket. I dialed a secure, unlisted number I had memorized over a decade ago. The line clicked open. "This is Dominic," a deep, tired voice answered. "Dom," I whispered into the freezing wind. "It is Grant. I need a federal investigator in my town by tomorrow morning. We are going hunting." The line fell silent for a heavy moment. "Who is the target, Grant?" "Everyone," I replied, staring at the flashing lights of the distant police cruiser. By dawn, I was sitting back in the plastic chair beside Harper's hospital bed, wearing the same tired flannel shirt from yesterday. The cold, calculating phantom of the night was buried beneath the hollow eyes of a grieving, helpless father. Dominic, a federal investigator, and the only man from my past I still trusted with my life, had arrived quietly in town before sunrise. He was already pulling the financial threads of Brooke and Sheriff Victor from an unmarked van parked miles away. The heavy wooden door to the ICU swung open, and Brooke walked in. She was carrying 2 cups of expensive, overly sweet coffee from a local cafe, acting as if she had just rushed over from a terrible night of crying alone in our empty house. "Good morning, sweetheart," she whispered, her voice layered with that sickening manufactured sympathy. She placed a cup in my hands and kissed my cheek. The scent of her crisp hotel soap from yesterday was gone, replaced by a heavy, expensive floral perfume. I wanted to throw the scalding coffee in her face. I wanted to grab her by the shoulders and scream that I knew exactly what she and her lover had done to our 8-year-old daughter for a $2 million payout. But a Delta Force operator never strikes when the enemy expects it. You wait until they are completely comfortable, standing on what they believe is solid ground, before you pull the earth out from under them. "How are you holding up, Brooke?" I asked, keeping my voice soft, broken, and completely devoid of suspicion. "I am just so shattered, Grant," she sighed, gently touching the edge of Harper's blanket without actually looking at the heavy metal halo brace drilled into our daughter's skull. "But Sheriff Victor called me this morning. He said they are closing the hit-and-run investigation. There is just no evidence. We have to start thinking about Harper's long-term care and the financial reality of this tragedy. There it was, the pivot, the transition from grieving mother to the cold execution of their twisted financial plan. "I know," I murmured, staring blankly at the floor. "The hospital bills are going to be astronomical. I do not know how we will survive this." Brooke took a deep, theatrical breath. "Grant, I spoke with a lawyer this morning. We need to unlock Harper's medical trust fund immediately. The $2 million your father left for her. If we do not file the paperwork declaring her permanently disabled by tomorrow, the state will freeze the assets pending the closed police report. We have to sign the release forms today." I looked up at her, letting a look of utter, pathetic defeat wash over my face. "You really think we should, Brooke? Just give up hope that she will recover?" "We have to be realistic, Grant," she said, her eyes flashing with a cold, desperate urgency. "We have to secure the money for her future. I already have the papers in my car. We just need a judge to sign off on the medical necessity." I nodded slowly. "Okay, bring me the papers. I will sign them." Brooke's tense shoulders instantly dropped in profound relief. She practically ran out of the room to fetch the documents that would secure her bloody payday. As soon as the heavy hospital door clicked shut behind her, my encrypted phone vibrated in my pocket. It was a secure text from Dominic. "The trust fund trap is set. Victor's offshore accounts are flagged. Waiting on your signal to pull the pin." I typed a single word in response: execute. 30 minutes later, Brooke returned with a thick stack of legal documents. I read through them quickly, acting overwhelmed by the legal jargon, while my eyes verified exactly what Dominic and I had anticipated. The payout was not going into a joint family account for Harper's medical care. It was being routed directly into a newly formed LLC, legally controlled solely by Brooke, with a massive, unexplainable wire transfer scheduled for an offshore bank in the Cayman Islands by Friday morning. Sheriff Victor's retirement fund. I picked up the black ink pen and signed my name on the dotted line. But I did not sign Grant. I signed a very specific, legally binding alias that Dominic had set up for me years ago during a federal operation, a signature that instantly triggered a massive, automated red flag across 3 different federal financial oversight agencies. "Thank you, Grant," Brooke whispered, quickly snatching the papers from my hands and shoving them into her designer purse. "I am going to take these straight to Judge Julian's chambers. He promised to expedite the medical seal so the funds clear immediately." "You do that, Brooke," I replied softly, turning my attention back to the rhythmic beeping of Harper's heart monitor. "You go get our money." She practically skipped out of the ICU, completely unaware that she was not walking toward a $2 million payday and a new life with a corrupt sheriff. She had just willingly handed the FBI undeniable, documented proof of massive wire fraud, conspiracy to commit insurance fraud, and the attempted murder of a minor for financial gain. The trap was permanently locked. They were completely blinded by their own greed. They thought the pathetic, grieving architect had just handed them the keys to the kingdom. They had absolutely no idea that by signing those papers, I had just signed their death warrants. The federal net was closing around the corrupt courthouse, the local police station, and the abandoned motel. Sheriff Victor's squad was about to be erased, and they were going to do the heavy lifting for me. The sky outside the hospital window turned a dark, bruised purple as the sun went down. The silence in the ICU was deafening, broken only by the steady hiss of Harper's ventilator. I sat beside her bed, watching the slow, rhythmic rise and fall of her chest beneath the thin hospital blanket. I did not move for hours. I was waiting. At 9:00 p.m., my encrypted phone finally buzzed. A single text from Dominic. The wire transfer hit the offshore account. Federal warrants are signed. The first domino is falling. I stood up, kissed my daughter's forehead, and walked out into the cold night air. I did not need to wear a mask or hide in the shadows anymore. The trap was sprung. Now, I just had to watch them tear themselves apart. I drove my motorcycle to the edge of town, parking near the local high school football field. I climbed the bleachers in the dark and pulled out my tablet, tapping into the local police dispatch frequencies Dominic had hacked for me. The radio crackled to life, but it was not the usual boring chatter about noise complaints or traffic stops. It was pure, untold panic. "Dispatch, this is Unit 4. We have federal agents raiding my house." Deputy Kyle's voice screamed through the speaker, breathless and terrified. "They are tearing up the floorboards. They found the cash from the warehouse." "Unit 4, stand by," the dispatcher replied, her voice shaking. "We have FBI units entering the main precinct. Sheriff Victor is not answering his radio." "Does anyone have eyes on Victor?" A heavy silence hung over the radio. Then, Deputy Blake's voice cut through the static, completely frantic. "Kyle, they are at my house too. They have the dash cam footage from the truck. They know we hit the girl. We have to run." I smiled in the dark. Dominic had moved faster than I expected. He didn't just freeze their accounts. He leaked the audio recording of their confession in the warehouse directly to the state police, bypassing the corrupt local judges entirely. "Blake, listen to me," Kyle shouted, his voice cracking with desperation. "Victor set us up. He took the wire transfer this afternoon and vanished. He left us to take the fall for the hit and run." "That lying piece of trash," Blake roared. "I am not going to federal prison for him. If I am going down, I am telling them everything about the trust fund and his deal with the architect's wife." I leaned back against the cold aluminum bleachers and closed my eyes, letting the sweet sound of their destruction wash over me. The squad was completely erased. The loyal deputies who had smiled while my daughter's neck was broken were now turning on each other like cornered rats, handing over every piece of evidence I needed to permanently bury them. No guns, no violence, just the crushing weight of their own greed. But the hunt was not over. Sheriff Victor and Brooke were still missing. They had the signed medical papers, and they believed they had successfully transferred $2 million out of the country. They thought they had won. My tablet beeped with a new GPS ping. Dominic had tracked Brooke's cell phone signal. She wasn't at our house. She was not at the abandoned motel. She was moving fast, heading toward the private county airfield on the northern border of town. Victor had a small, single-engine plane registered under a shell company. They were trying to disappear before the federal net closed entirely. I fired up the motorcycle. The engine roared to life, shattering the quiet suburban night. I tore down the empty highway, the cold wind whipping against my jacket. I wasn't going to let them escape. I wasn't going to let them live out their days on a beach, spending the money they had bled from my little girl. When I reached the airfield, the chain-link gate was smashed open. I killed the engine and coasted silently onto the dark tarmac. The hangar doors were wide open, and the small plane was already pulled out onto the runway, its propellers spinning with a deafening roar. Sheriff Victor was throwing heavy duffel bags into the back seat. Brooke was standing near the wing, clutching her designer purse, screaming over the noise of the engine for him to hurry up. She looked terrified, constantly checking her phone, probably wondering why her offshore bank app was suddenly locked out. Stepped out of the shadows and walked slowly onto the tarmac. I didn't run. I didn't draw a weapon. I just walked straight toward the spinning propellers, completely exposed in the bright landing lights. Brooke saw me first. The blood instantly drained from her face. She dropped her purse, the expensive leather hitting the concrete with a heavy thud. She grabbed Victor's arm and pointed frantically in my direction. Victor spun around, his hand instinctively dropping to the heavy silver pistol on his hip. He stared at me, his eyes wide with shock. The soft, pathetic architect who had cried in the hospital room was gone. The man walking toward him now was a ghost, standing exactly where he was not supposed to be, completely unafraid of the gun in his hand. Victor drew his weapon and aimed it squarely at my chest. "Stop right there, Grant," he screamed over the roar of the plane. "I will put a bullet in you right now." I swear to God, I did not stop. I kept walking, closing the distance between us, my eyes locked onto his. "You can try. You can try, Victor," I said quietly, though my voice carried easily through the noise. "But you cannot spend $2 million if you are dead. And right now, there are 3 federal sniper rifles pointed directly at your head. Look at my chest." Victor froze. He slowly lowered his eyes. A single bright red laser dot was resting perfectly over his heart. Then another appeared on his forehead, and another on Brooks' chest. Dominic's tactical team had been waiting in the dark hangar the entire time. The plane was never going to take off. The money was never going to clear. The trap was completely shut, and they had just walked right into the center of it. The deafening roar of the single-engine plane slowly sputtered and died as Dominic's tactical team surged out of the dark hangar. The red laser sights held perfectly still on Victor and Brooke. For a man who had spent his entire career acting like the untouchable king of our small county, Sheriff Victor looked remarkably small. He slowly placed his heavy silver pistol on the tarmac and raised his trembling hands. Brooke did not raise her hands. She collapsed onto her knees, clutching her designer purse against her chest like it was a shield. She looked frantically between the armed federal agents and me, her mind clearly short-circuiting as she tried to understand how the soft, grieving architect she had manipulated for years had just orchestrated a federal raid. "Grant, please," she screamed over the wind, tears streaming down her face, real tears this time. "They forced me. Victor threatened me. I never wanted Harper to get hurt. You have to believe me." I stopped 5 feet away from her. I looked down at the woman I had built a life with, the mother of my child, and felt absolutely nothing. The anger was gone. The betrayal had burned itself out, leaving only cold, objective justice. "You signed the medical release forms this morning, Brooke," I said softly, my voice carrying clearly across the quiet tarmac. "You did not hesitate. You did not cry when you realized the offshore wire transfer was scheduled to clear before Harper even woke up from her coma. You only started crying when the money stopped." "Grant, you do not understand." Victor spat, his arrogance finally cracking as Dominic slammed cold steel handcuffs onto his wrists. "That money was ours. The town owed me. I kept this place safe for 20 years. "And then you ran over an 8-year-old girl in the mud," I replied, turning my back on him as the agents dragged him toward the armored vans. But the night was not over. The next morning, the sun rose over a town that had been completely hollowed out. The local news stations were running non-stop coverage of the massive federal corruption bust. Deputies Blake and Kyle had surrendered before midnight, turning state's evidence against Victor in exchange for reduced sentences. The sheriff's department was effectively dismantled by dawn, exactly as I had promised myself in that hospital room. However, the legal system is a slow, grinding machine, and Brooke had one last, desperate card to play. Because she had not physically driven the truck that hit Harper, her high-priced defense attorney managed to secure an emergency bail hearing at the county courthouse. Brooke was determined to fight for custody of Harper and the remaining trust fund, claiming she was a victim of Victor's manipulation, and that I, a deeply traumatized veteran, was an unfit father who had terrorized her. I walked into the courtroom at 10:00 a.m. The heavy wooden doors closed behind me, shutting out the media circus in the hallway. Judge Julian, the same corrupt silver-haired judge who had dismissed my investigation 2 days ago, was sitting on the bench. He looked pale and sweating, acutely aware that federal agents were sitting in the back row, watching his every move. Brooke sat at the defense table, wearing a conservative, pale blue dress, her hair pulled back neatly. She looked like the perfect, tragic suburban mother. When I sat at the plaintiff's table, she refused to look at me. "Your Honor," Brooks' attorney began, his voice dripping with practiced sincerity. "My client is a victim of extreme coercion by law enforcement. She was manipulated into signing financial documents under duress. Furthermore, we believe her husband, Grant, poses a severe psychological threat to their daughter, Harper. We are formally requesting immediate, sole legal custody and full control of the medical trust fund to ensure the child's safety." I did not blink. I did not object. I just waited. Judge Julian cleared his throat nervously, his eyes darting toward the federal agents in the back row. "Mr. Given the highly unusual nature of these federal indictments against the Sheriff's Department, the court must carefully consider the safest environment for the minor child. Do you have any evidence to present regarding your wife's alleged involvement?" I stood up slowly. I did not have a lawyer. I did not need one. I reached into the pocket of my jacket and placed a small silver USB drive on the wooden table. "Your Honor, I do not have a legal argument," I said calmly. "I just have a conversation." Dominic stepped forward from the back of the room, plugging the drive into the court's audio system. The courtroom fell into absolute, suffocating silence. Then Brooks' own voice echoed through the speakers, crystal clear, recorded through the cracked window of the abandoned motel 2 days ago. "Victor, I cannot keep acting like this. Grant was staring at me in the hospital room. He looked right through me. What if he knows?" Brooke physically flinched at the defense table, her perfectly manicured hands gripping the edge of the wood so hard her knuckles turned white. Then came the devastating blow. Her own voice, whining about the very daughter she was currently fighting to protect. "But Harper? Victor, her neck! You promised me she would just get a broken arm. You promised she would just be scared enough so we could claim the stress and finalize the custody papers." The audio cut off. The silence in the courtroom was so heavy, it felt like the air had been sucked out of the room. Judge Julian stared at Brooke with wide, horrified eyes. Even her own high-priced defense attorney slowly moved his chair an inch away from her in pure disgust. There was no manipulation. There was no duress. It was cold, calculated, premeditated child abuse for financial gain, spoken in her own voice. Brooke did not scream. She did not cry. The mask finally slipped completely, revealing the hollow, empty person underneath. She stared at the floor, totally defeated. "Bail is revoked," Judge Julian stammered, his gavel hitting the block with a weak, trembling thud. "The defendant is remanded to federal custody pending trial for conspiracy, wire fraud, and attempted murder. Full custody and control of all medical trusts are permanently awarded to the father." I turned and walked out of the courtroom before the bailiffs even put the handcuffs on her. The checkmate was complete. The ghost had done its job, and now it was time for the father to go home. The heavy oak doors of the county courthouse closed behind me with a solid, echoing thud. The media circus was already waiting on the front steps, their camera flashes blinding in the mid-morning sun. Reporters shouted questions about the massive corruption scandal, asking how a quiet architect had single-handedly orchestrated the downfall of Sheriff Victor and his entire department. I did not answer a single one of them. I pulled my collar up against the cold wind, walked past the sea of microphones, and got onto my motorcycle. The war was over. I had dismantled the squad, secured my daughter's future, and watched my own wife get hauled away in federal handcuffs, all without firing a single weapon. The ghost was going back to sleep, hopefully forever. I drove straight to the hospital. The familiar, sterile smell of the ICU hallway did not feel suffocating anymore. It felt incredibly quiet, peaceful. When I pushed open the door to Harper's room, Dominic was sitting in the plastic chair by the window, reading a newspaper. The federal investigator looked up, offered a tired, genuine smile, and silently folded the paper. He did not need to ask how the bail hearing went. The local news playing on the small TV in the corner of the room was already broadcasting Brooke's permanent transfer to a maximum security federal holding facility. She was facing 30 years for conspiracy and attempted murder. Sheriff Victor and his deputies were looking at the rest of their natural lives behind bars. "The offshore accounts have been fully recovered, Grant," Dominic said softly, standing up to leave. "The $2 million is safely locked in the new trust. Your alias has been scrubbed from the financial flags. You are officially just a dad again." "Thank you, Dom," I replied, shaking his hand firmly. "For everything." He nodded, giving Harper's sleeping form one last look before slipping quietly out the door. I sat down in the chair beside my daughter's bed. The terrifying, heavy metal halo brace was still bolted around her fragile skull, keeping her fractured spine perfectly aligned. The rhythmic hollow beep of the heart monitor was steady and strong. I reached out, my hands trembling just a little, and gently wrapped my fingers around her small, pale hand. It was warm. I did not need to jump ahead 6 months or a year to know that we were going to be okay. Healing does not happen in a sudden magical montage. It happens right now, in the quiet, agonizing moments of just sitting in a hospital room and waiting for the dawn. We had a brutally long road of physical therapy and surgeries ahead of us. We were going to have to learn how to be a family of two. I would have to figure out how to explain to my beautiful, innocent little girl why her mother was never coming home again. But for the first time in days, the crushing weight on my chest was gone. The shadows had been completely cleared from our lives. As I sat there, lost in thought, I felt a tiny, almost imperceptible squeeze against my palm. I froze. I stopped breathing entirely. I looked down at Harper's hand. Her small fingers twitched, gripping mine back. Slowly, painfully, her eyelids fluttered. The heavy medication that had kept her in a medically induced coma for the last 3 days was finally wearing off. Her beautiful, tired eyes opened halfway. She could not turn her head because of the metal brace, but her eyes found my face. They were foggy, confused, and filled with fear. "Dad," she whispered, her voice rough and terrifyingly weak. I leaned over the bed, tears finally breaking through the cold, solid ice I had buried my heart under. I did not cry for revenge. I did not cry for the betrayal. I cried because, in that single beautiful word, I had everything in the world that mattered. "I am right here, sweetie," I choked out, pressing my forehead gently against the edge of her mattress. "I have got you. Nobody is ever going to hurt you again. I promise." Harper gave me a tiny, exhausted smile, her eyes slowly drifting shut again as the monitors continued their steady, rhythmic song of life. She was safe. The bad men were gone, and the father who loved her more than his own soul was never going to leave her side. We all have moments in life where the people we trust the most shatter our reality, leaving us to pick up the pieces in the dark. Grant found his justice without losing his humanity. But I have to ask you, if you were standing on that freezing tarmac, watching the people who broke your child trying to fly away with everything, could you have kept your finger off the trigger? Would you have let the law handle it? Or would you have handled it yourself? I would really love to hear your honest thoughts, so please drop your answer in the comments below. And while you are down there, tell me where in the world you are listening from today. I love seeing how far these stories travel. If Grant's quiet, calculated revenge kept you on the edge of your seat, gently tap that like button and consider subscribing to our little community here at Betrayal Stories Lab. More importantly, tell me what kind of stories you are craving next. You want more military justice, deep family secrets, or mind-bending corporate betrayal? You tell me what you want to hear, and I will bring those shadows to life for you. Until we meet again in our next epic thriller, take care of yourselves and protect the ones you love.